As Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine rages on the battlefield, it is also using disinformation campaigns to promote false narratives. In a conflict zone special at the Munich Security Conference, I spoke with the Czech Republic's foreign minister, NATO's assistant secretary general, Google's president of global affairs, and a South African disinformation specialist. How can the truth win in the battle against disinformation? Hello, everyone, and welcome to Disinformation, Navigating the Battle of Narratives. We're here at the Munich Security Conference, and we have a very distinguished panel. And Mr. Foreign Minister, I'd like to begin with you because disinformation is a big part of Russia's war in Ukraine as they attempt to dominate the narrative around the world. And I'm just going to give one example. Kremlin-led propaganda blaming a global food crisis on EU sanctions has spread in Africa and in the Middle East. So when we're looking at the Czech Republic, when you're looking at the situation, how big do you see the security threat of disinformation?
It's a huge concern, and but we should acknowledge that this is not something new. This kind of information warfare, as it is understood by Russians, they play this book at least 1 century. So we have a little bit forgotten how to fight with that and what is the proper cure.
It's not different in the digital age?
Absolutely. It's the same as in the age of newspapers or radios. People are gossiping, people are thinking about things, asking questions, creating and crafting conspiracy theories. So what is the proper answer in the digital age when everything is very quick and fast? That we need to have a capacity to react. States needs to have capacity to react and to be trustworthy to society.
And we understand that your country is actually debating right now criminalizing the intentional dissemination of disinformation. So I'm going to ask you a little bit more about that a little bit further in the conversation. But first, I'd like to turn to the Assistant Secretary General of NATO to get your view here. And I'm going to add another piece of disinformation into the mix now. This is from pro-Kremlin sources, which say that NATO is not only threatening Russia, but may even wish to invade it. So when you see that, where do those threats, that disinformation, stand on the spectrum of security risks right now for the alliance?
Well, thanks a lot. NATO also was accused by Russians of creating the earthquake in Turkey, just to put things out there. So it's, I mean, everything that is happening in the world is in a way fault of either the US or NATO in the world of Russia. And for us, again, as the minister said, that's nothing new. That has been there forever for NATO, and that's part of Russia's political warfare. But in the same time, of course, on our side, on NATO's side, we clearly identify information. We clearly identify the means how to defend ourselves as part of the instrument of power. So when we look at the whole spectrum of instruments of power, what we have is diplomacy, we have information, we have military instrument of power, economic, legal, and so on and so forth. And only the information is across both civil and military spectrum. What it means is that information contributes to the implementation of NATO's mission. NATO is a defensive alliance. It's based on the UN Charter, Article 51. If there is armed attack, the collective defense principle comes in. And that is what NATO is about. So we do defend also in information sphere by making sure that we know what is happening. So we invest a lot in information environment understanding, but we also do a lot of comms, making sure that our core tasks, that turns defense of our populations, the crisis management and cooperative security, that it's all reflected in what we do. So we are being proactive. So there's a whole spectrum of activities that we make sure that our populations, our stated threats, Russia and terrorist groups, right, and partners know what NATO is about.
Okay. Phumzile, I'm turning to you now. I would like to ask you, because you have really seen firsthand, actually, in your country, South Africa, what happens with these campaigns to, one in particular, to stoke racial hatred and unrest in the country. Through your activism, you were actually a contributor to kicking out a major PR firm that was behind that. And I'm wondering, that experience that you had, How has that informed now what you're seeing going on in the continent, where we're seeing Russia and China make major inroads when it comes to disseminating disinformation and gaining a foothold, and those narratives often feeding into each other as well?
Yeah. So from my kind of work against disinformation in South Africa, I got to see firsthand, as you've correctly said. But nowadays, the danger of disinformation is electoral interference. As the story in The Guardian revealed, there was electoral interference in the Kenyan election. So what my kind of greater point is that there needs to be far greater focus on the African continent. So as a basis to spread kind of anti-Ukraine disinformation on social media, a lot of African accounts are being used. So that's the kind of playground and arena that they're using to spread disinformation. So I'd like to see the conversation moving beyond just the US or the EU and going into Africa. The deadliest war right now is in Ethiopia, and that one's not getting enough attention. So I'd really like to see a greater focus from the global community on the harms that are being caused on the African continent by disinformation, by Russia through disinformation, by China through the purchase of media outlets. So I think that's where the greatest threat is, and a lot of attention needs to be focused.
Okay, thank you so much. You know, on this panel, we have a lot of public representation, but also, of course, private representation. Kent, I'm turning to you, of course. YouTube's reach, there's more than 2 billion active users on the platform, we understand. Last year, the International Fact-Checking Network, representing more than 80 organizations, they had the following warning, and I'd just like to read out the quote. One of the major conduits of online disinformation and misinformation worldwide is YouTube. They said that it is not addressing the problem. Fair criticism?
I think we're making dramatic strides in improving the quality of the content online. Google Search and Google News are antidotes to fake news in most cases. Not that we always get it right, but we are working every day to make sure that the quality of the content, the authoritativeness of the content on all of our platforms is reliable and trustworthy. The challenge on a product like YouTube, where users are uploading a whole variety of content, hundreds of hours every minute, has been to identify problematic content and remove it quickly. And the good news is that the progress has been dramatic. So we have gone from a few years ago having 1 view in 100 on the YouTube platform violating our policies to 1 view on 1,000 using advanced artificial intelligence, enhanced enforcement techniques, et cetera. So we are continuing to progress that. We recognize, particularly in a war situation, the old line is that truth is the first casualty of war. There will be more and more efforts to try and spread disinformation on all platforms. It's one of the reasons why very quickly after the invasion, we removed RT and other platforms. We actually saw them moving from Europe and the United States into Africa. We did this on a global basis, however. We have now removed thousands of channels from YouTube and tens of thousands of videos that are conveying disinformation. So we're making progress, but job's not done.
Let me ask you a little bit more about how you're making that progress, though, because you know, there are reports that last month, for example, this is reporting from the New York Times, that YouTube quietly reduced its small team of policy experts in charge of handling misinformation. And here's what the critics say, Kent. They say that they're concerned that you're putting the bottom line above the public good in the battle to combat disinformation. So what do you tell them right now when we're in an environment with economic headwinds?
Sure, it's clearly not the case. We have tens of thousands of people working across Google and YouTube reviewing mis and disinformation. The Times story you refer to, the evidence was a team of 5 people, of whom 3 had been moved out of 20 or 30,000 people working on this problem. And the more important area is beyond the number of people. It's the number of engineers and AI tools we can put against this problem. That's what allows us to quickly identify and remove problematic content. So I would say our investment in this area has grown dramatically and continues to grow.
Phumzile, I'd like you to jump in here and perhaps respond to what we've been hearing from Kent, because something that I mentioned a little bit earlier. You're founder of South Africa's first electoral disinformation monitoring project. What more would you like to see from the big tech platforms, and are you satisfied with what you're hearing?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of work big tech platforms could do. And I think, to be fair, Google's one of the better ones. But we've seen a lot of disinformation spreading from Facebook, from Twitter. And I think the great problem in Africa, unlike in the EU or the US, where there's been legislation, in a lot of African countries, people don't necessarily understand why this is important. I think there's lots of concerns around basic bread and butter issues that people don't necessarily appreciate what a grave danger disinformation is. Beyond kind of electoral disinformation and manipulating the public discourse, but actually fanning wars. So I think there is so much more platforms could do. One, a basic thing is having content moderation in beyond just English, but in languages that are spoken in Africa. So that's a huge problem we've identified. And we've noticed that there just seems to be very little care of what's happening in the online space from social media platforms.
Okay. Assistant Secretary General, I'd like you to also weigh in, and then we'll hear from the Foreign Minister.
On the private sector, I think it's part of the problem, as was rightly identified, but it's also part of the answer. Currently, we will not be able to get to a society that are resilient with both the governments, the individuals, the groups, the private individuals' education system, have an understanding of how to treat information as part of everyday life, like we treat cyber, like we treat other hybrid threats, without the private sector. So actually the trainings, the investment in literally everyday security features for people at a certain age, and the training is crucial. Again, every country, every society will do it differently. But responsibility lies with everyone. It lies with big international organizations like NATO to make sure that our core tasks, the defense of citizens against external aggression, is implemented. But also this responsibility is to the private sector, because obviously, and we have seen, as you said, with a number of platforms, they don't invest in smaller languages, identifying the hostile or disinformation patterns. They don't take the content seriously in smaller languages because the markets are smaller. They don't treat the advertisements the same way. So there is space for improvement, I think, in a lot of places there.
Sir, could I interrupt for just a moment?
I just want to hear briefly from the Foreign Minister first. And what I wanted to ask you was, the EU has recently revamped its anti-disinformation code as part of the Digital Services Act. And some of the criticism of that is that it largely relies on voluntary measures. What do you need to see from the big tech platforms? And do you have any hope, actually, that approach might work?
I agree that I have seen a lot of disinformation on Facebook and on YouTube. But in my case, the biggest number of disinformation I've heard was from my mother-in-law. So are we to regulate it somehow? I don't think so. And therefore, it goes to...
Are you still married?
It goes to how the whole society works and how the whole fabric of society works. And of course, the digital platforms are important messengers and are the new actors in that. And in traditional media, we know how to, or they are regulate the content of it. On the other side, we are learning that for the digital platforms. And I think the act you mentioned is the way how to find a consensus in society, how to approach to algorithm, so we don't we don't apply censorship as such, but certain algorithms doesn't need to promote it to everywhere. And we are also learning how the emotions in society works in a new way because these digital platforms are very effective at spreading emotions. So that would be my input into that. You ask about the debate in Czechia about this new law. It's a very premature to debate. I don't think that we need to criminalize something which is already in a criminal code of most democracies or in democratic countries. You can lie, but you cannot lie in a way that it causes harmful effect. Right? I think this is the most important distinction, which also applies for spreading disinformation, misinformation, etc., etc. So the platforms are important part of that, and I think Google is doing a fair share. And I think we are over the time. I think it was maybe like 5 years back when we really had a serious debate with big tech if this companies will take responsibility for effects, what the platforms are doing. I think they are now accepting that. That's my view on that, and I would like to thank you for that.
Ken, I'm going to let you jump in, but I also want to add perhaps a little bit of food for thought here and shift our conversation to the race to dominate AI right now. A huge conversation around these chatbots that are out there, especially ChatGPT. We have people calling it, some of them, the most powerful tool for spreading misinformation on the internet, that it has the potential to do so. We understand Google has a rival Bard as well. Legislators are sounding the alarm. Where are the safeguards?
So let me start by responding very quickly to a prior panelist and then come back to this question. I very much share the notion of platforms having a shared responsibility with governments in addressing this problem. So for example, in Czechia, as well as Slovakia, Poland, and soon in Germany, we have launched something called pre-bunking, which is trying to work together to make people more resilient against the risk of fake news, disinformation, things like overly emotional pitches or one-sided presentations. YouTube has a program called Hit Pause, which is reaching out to 1 billion users to say, before you buy off on something, hit pause, do your own research, double check, get the facts. We've actually seen numbers that people are in fact influenced by this and are more resilient, more skeptical of some of the claims we're seeing out there. So I think there are ways of affirmatively playing offense. And Phumzile, back to your point, we're proud that we have expanded the Google Translate tool up to now, I think, something like 400 languages. This is allowing us, in addition to the 80 or so languages we're already covering in Europe, to expand into Africa, the Middle East, the Asia-Pacific region, et cetera. So it's an important area of research, and more than research, actually, bring it to product. Now, Sarah, back to your question. There's obviously been a lot of work around the AI generally and large language models in particular. This is a technology that Google pioneered in 2017, something called transformers. The payoff from that innovation has been dramatic. We tend to focus on the chatbots, but it's also important to realize that this is bringing huge advances in science and technology, precision agriculture, nuclear fusion, personalized medicine. It's people who have studied computer science their entire career say they have never seen anything like the inflection point we're at now. Now, within those incredible promises comes the risk of abuse and misuse. AI plays on both sides of this equation. We are able to identify misinformation much more quickly because we use AI tools, and we'll expand how we're using them and using them in languages around the world. Without AI, we couldn't do nearly the job we do today. But you're also right that the synthesis and the dissemination of these tools that allow so many more people, that everybody has their own megaphone, creates a new set of social challenges. Some legal, as addressed, some technological, on our side, product design, right, and some in terms of social norms.
Yeah.
Please.
Phumzile, weigh in.
I think the challenge posed by AI, and particularly chatbots, I don't see it at all as something very easy to deal with, particularly for regulators, because there are all these changes coming up all the time, and they just can't keep up. So in terms of dealing with it needs a whole of society approach, as the foreign minister pointed out. The mother-in-law example, I've become kind of the fact verifier for my mother and her circle of friends. You know, they send everything, and I have to say, no, vaccines will not do that. No, you're not being microchipped. So I think there's, a greater response beyond the platforms, beyond the regulators, and just for communities. So I like the idea of investing in pre-bunking, because that's actually the most powerful tool. Because once something has gone viral, it's really, really difficult to debunk. So there needs to be more investment in digital literacy. So I think everyone has a role to play: academia, civil society, regulators, platforms.
I'd like to get the view now from NATO, from the Assistant Secretary General. I mean, when you're looking at actors
Can I just
bent...
quickly comment on what Phumzile was saying? I could sign what you were saying, because really that is our approach. Because literally, you have to really understand the information environment, not only in your own country, but also whatever external, internal, hostile information activities. Because again, what the intent really is. And because, for example, in Russia's case, they use a whole selection of power, of instruments of power, including kinetic. For NATO, the answer is also the whole spectrum of instruments of power. We have to be ready militarily, we have to be ready on diplomatic front, we have to be ready on the legal front, and so on and so forth. And that applies to the allies, that applies to the governments, to the societies, to every unit of the society. And in that respect, what we call resilient societies, the whole government, the whole society approach is the only approach. And again, South African challenges are different, and you spoke of those challenges, and I fully agree. But again, that's a whole society approach. There is nothing else that today will work, because the whole way how we process, how we work with information, how we are influenced, how we influence others has changed. It's not going to go back anymore. And private sector is an essential element in that security, a security provider for our societies.
Mr. Foreign Minister, do you think we have an appropriate sense of urgency right now about what might be coming down the bend for us?
I think we do. The actions done on the level of EU, the working group for disinformation, the Eastern Stratcom, during the beginning of the Czech presidency to the EU, some conclusions on that were also done. So yes, we do have it, we understand it. Paradoxically, the Russian imperial war against Ukraine is helping us to see what the real danger is.
Okay. We are nearing the end of the live stream portion of our conversation. I'd just like to pose a challenge right now to our panel, and perhaps leave on an optimistic note on the future. And Phumzile, I'd like to begin with you. The focus of the Munich Security Conference this year is on revision. So that means working toward a much more attractive version of the rules-based order. When it comes to disinformation, what do you think needs to be done to make truth more profitable and or more attractive than disinformation? What opportunities do you see? And if you could answer in 2 sentences, that would be amazing.
Yeah, so my kind of focus as part of the greater global community against disinformation is on the African continent, and the initiatives that I'm going to kind of be working with other civil society partners is going into African elections and setting up disinformation projects. And those projects aren't solely focused on digital monitoring or fact-checking, but kind of instilling a whole of society kind of approach to protecting elections against disinformation. So what my message would be is the platforms need to pay a little bit more attention to what's happening in Africa. The global community needs to pay a bit more attention to what's happening in Africa and provide support to those on the ground doing that work.
An important message. Kent, 2 sentences?
We have to affect both the supply and the demand side of the equation. If we want to make truth more profitable, we need to change social expectations and desire for wanting to get high-quality information, regardless of the tool, AI, algorithms, or what you're reading in your daily press. We talk about being bold and responsible. That has to be a shared obligation. Again, as we've talked about, the Secretary General was speaking about, how do we figure out how to work together to have a new era of media literacy among our populations and a new era of social responsibility among platforms and governments?
Madam Assistant Secretary General.
One thing, the good news is that Russia is failing not only in the kinetic war, Russia is also failing in the information war. We see that we poll the audiences in NATO countries.
Really?
Neither Russia nor China is succeeding. So that's why they are trying all types of other desperate measures, splitting societies, creating chaos, fragmentation. Everything has to be not believed, not trusted. Everything has to be questioned, and so on and so forth. So creating a situation where there is no truth. So we need truth heroes. We need heroes that are popular, speaking truth in all societies, from South Africa to Iceland and elsewhere.
Foreign Minister, are those heroes elected officials?
I think two issues can be solved, not easily, but solved. First of all, demonetization. Many content creators and platforms make money from disinformation. If this is targeted, it would help to decrease the level of spreading and accountability. We need to be working on that so that the harmful lying is not for free.
That concludes our panel, Disinformation, Navigating the Battle of Narratives. Thank you so much to everyone here on the stage.
Thank you.